Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Few important things before we start today's discussion. Number one, based on the popular demand, our monthly current affairs magazine is available on our website. Please download the same. Second, again on popular demand, we have started online sociology optional classes. If you wish to enroll for these classes, drop in your details, fill the form provided under the comment section, and we shall get back to you. Third, it's a request. If you're liking our initiatives, please like this video, comment, and subscribe to our channel. That's the only way in which we realize and understand whether our efforts are being appreciated by you or not. So please do that, and let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper, beginning with LPG scheme to cover poor people. Now, in 2016, Prime Minister Modi launched a program called Ujjwala Yojana. What was the objective? The objective was that the dirty cooking fuel, for example, chulas, where wood is used by poor households in rural India, below poverty line households in rural India, since it is a cause of air pollution and it is also affecting the health of our mothers and sisters. Prime Minister Modi launched this program that we will replace this dirty cooking fuel with LPG. The objective was that 5 crore women will be provided LPG connections till 2019. Previously, connections were given to the people on the basis of socio-economic caste census of 2011. Then this program was extended to include all SC/ST households. Then this program was extended to include forest dwellers. Then this program was extended to include most backward classes. But now this program to provide LPG connection has been extended to all poor people. But now let us look at this newspaper article in slight detail and analyze whether this program Ujjwala Yojana is working on the ground or not. That is very important from your mains perspective. If you look at India, indoor air pollution has been a problem. And this indoor air pollution is the second biggest killer after blood pressure. According to government, by the end of this year, 6 crore LPG connections would be given. But distributing LPG connection is a job half done. What is it that the government needs to do now? Sustain the usage of this LPG connection. That's something which is very, very important, because we have to get the people not only to take these LPG connections, but we have to get the people to utilize and use this LPG connection. According to Down to Earth magazine, the enthusiasm fizzles out when it comes to using LPG connection for cooking regularly. That means people are very enthusiastic when they get this LPG connection. But this enthusiasm fizzles out when they have to start using this LPG for cooking, and that too regularly. And this is where we hit upon another problem. And that problem is of inactive accounts. What are these inactive accounts? For example, if you have been given an LPG connection and you are not approaching the gas agency to refill the cylinder every 3 months, then that means you're not using the LPG connection and your account will be clubbed as inactive account. A lot of rural customers took LPG connection, but they didn't use it regularly. Let me give you the data. In January 2018, according to Down to Earth magazine, the number of these inactive accounts was 3.8 crore. According to the website of Ujjwala Yojana, total connections given as of now stand at 3.98 crore. That means 3.98 crore LPG connections have been given, and out of them 3.8 crore connections have been declared as inactive because people are not approaching the gas agencies for refilling these cylinders. That means they are not using the LPG connection regularly for cooking purposes. That means simply new Ujjwala Yojana connections are given, but they do not translate into sustained use of these LPG connections. Let's look at the CAG report. CAG report tells us that in the year 2015-2016, before the launch of Ujjwala Yojana, households using the LPG connection, it was 6.27 cylinders per year. That means the households in India were using at least 6.27 cylinders every year before the launch of Ujjwala Yojana. After the Ujjwala Yojana was launched, after the scheme, the number of cylinders used by households, it has decreased to 5.6 cylinders per year. That means Ujjwala Yojana, although it is leading to more and more LPG connections are given to the people, but it is not translating into the sustained use of these LPG gas cylinders. That is what we need to do now. The government needs to reduce the price, provide more and more subsidies so that rural people, poor people can use LPG gas connections regularly for the cooking purposes. That is what you need to understand from this newspaper article. Now let us look at another important news. Indian Air Force plane takes to the air on blended biofuel using something called Jatropha oil. Now let us look at all the details that you need to know from this newspaper article. We have Jatropha. And what is Jatropha? Basically, Jatropha is a flowering plant. And these plants, they produce separate male and female flowers. But these flowering plants, they also contain compounds that are toxic. But at the same time, Jatropha, one of the species of Jatropha can be used for biodiesel production. And which Jatropha species is used for biodiesel production? Jatropha curcas. But how? Seeds of this plant, they're very rich in oil. Former President APJ Abdul Kalam said he was a strong advocate of Jatropha cultivation so that these Jatropha oils can be used for biodiesel. We are hungry for oil in India. One, because our crude oil output is stagnant. We have not been in a position to identify many different sources of oil. But at the same time, the demand for oil is increasing. And that is also affecting our economy. Because as the prices of crude oil in international market increases, our current account deficit also widens. Inflation also increases and it has a negative impact on our economy. So what we have to do, we have to look for substitutes. And substitutes can be good both economically as well as ecologically. Because if we find more substitutes to the crude oil, our economy will be in a better resilient position, and at the same time it will be good for our ecology because the substitutes would be less polluting the environment as well. One substitute is ethanol. And how is this ethanol produced? Ethanol is produced from sugarcane. We have another substitute and that is this biodiesel. And how is this biodiesel produced? We can produce biodiesel from those plants whose seeds are rich in oil. And one such example is Jatropha curcas. In India, there is a vast potential for the production of biodiesel from this Jatropha curcas. But now let's look at the history. The year was 2009. A mission was launched by the then government. This mission was National Biodiesel Mission. This National Biodiesel Mission identified as the most suitable oil seed for our biodiesel production. That means this National Biodiesel Mission identified Jatropha curcas as the most suitable oil seed for our biodiesel production. The intention was that we will have 20% of oil from Jatropha curcas, then we will have 80% diesel, and then we will blend it. And this blended fuel is called biodiesel. And we will use this biodiesel from the year 2017 onwards. That means this biodiesel is basically blended oil from Jatropha with 80% diesel. But this plan did not materialize. Why? Number one, there was acute shortage of Jatropha seeds. There were several corporations in India, petrol companies in India, private companies in India. They entered into memorandum of understanding with various state governments, at least 6 state governments, so that we can promote the plantation of Jatropha seeds in India. Where can we promote plantation of Jatropha seeds? Wastelands. These wastelands are most suitable for Jatropha cultivation, can be important statement for your prelims exam. But then there were constraints. Constraints number one, yield of Jatropha seeds was very poor. Second, wastelands, there were limited availability of wastelands. Third, the maintenance cost of these wastelands was also huge. And that made our biodiesel project unviable in India. But Jatropha, although it is very suitable oilseed for biodiesel production, but there were some obstacles, there were some constraints, and that is why our national mission for biodiesel, it did not meet its objective. It did not realize the objective that we set out to achieve. But there were other obstacles as well. For example, these biodiesel crops, they have a higher gestation period. For Jatropha, for example, the gestation period is 3 to 5 years. That means payback period for a farmer is very large. That means farmers will not be in a position to survive and sustain for 3 years or 4 years. And in the absence of state support, it became difficult for this national biodiesel mission to turn into a success. Now there is an urgent need for research. Involve public sector oil marketing companies so that they can invest money in research, so that this research can lead to higher yield of Jatropha seeds, shorter duration crops are achieved, and ultimately Jatropha cultivation is planned in such a manner that its cultivation is beneficial for the farmer as well. And this is where we can also involve Indian Council for Agricultural Research. That means, what is the news? The news is that Indian Air Force flew with blended biojet fuel produced from Jatropha oil. But this is not for the first time. In August, SpiceJet had used the fuel obtained from the Jatropha oil. But now we need to make serious research so that we are able to use this biodiesel effectively going forward. That is what you need to understand from this newspaper article. Now let's look at another news on page number 10. Transgender bill passed in Lok Sabha. In the year 2014, in a landmark Nalsa judgment, Supreme Court declared transgenders as third gender in this country. Supreme Court said recognizing transgender as a third gender is not only a human rights issue, but it's also a social issue. And Supreme Court said these transgenders should be declared as socially and educationally backward classes of citizens because they have been neglected. So that means Supreme Court said affirmative action policy should be provided for transgenders. Transgenders should be provided with a reservation in jobs in educational institutions because they are socially and educationally backward. Then what happened in 2015? For the first time in the history of Rajya Sabha, a private member's bill on transgenders was introduced by a DMK MP and ultimately it was passed by Rajya Sabha. This was for the first time a private member's bill was passed in Rajya Sabha. But then the government introduced its own bill called Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Bill 2016. And this bill has now been passed in the Lok Sabha. But we will wait for the passage of this bill in the Rajya Sabha and then we will have an elaborate discussion on various shortcomings about this bill. Because there are some various shortcomings about this bill. Number one, if Supreme Court said in 2014 that transgenders should be provided reservation because they are socially and educationally backward, this bill does not talk about reservation. Second, transgender judgment when it was given by the Supreme Court said that self-identification of a gender if you are self-identifying your gender as either male or female or transgender, that is intrinsically part of your fundamental right to life and personal liberty under Article 21 of Indian Constitution. But this time, this bill says that you will be provided this gender, transgender, if a screening committee will authorize it. That means you can't self-identify your gender as transgender. A screening committee shall have to identify, which will consist of district authorities, a psychologist, and then they will decide whether you are a transgender or not. So that means this bill has violated some of the important pronouncements made by the Supreme Court in 2014. But we will have an elaborate discussion once the bill is passed and it enters into force. Now let's look at another issue, new triple talaq bill introduced. Supreme Court, what it said in Shaira Banu versus Union of India. Supreme Court said instant triple talaq. When you pronounce talaq 3 times in a single utterance, that is invalid. When it is invalid, that means instant triple talaq will not lead to divorce. The marriage is still valid. But then the government said even after this verdict of the Supreme Court, there were more than 250 instances where husbands would pronounce instant triple talaq on their wives and ultimately they would abandon their wives. To safeguard the rights of the Muslim women, the government introduced a bill in the parliament called Muslim Women Protection of Rights on Marriage Bill 2018. But this bill, although it was passed by the Lok Sabha, it was met with stiff opposition in the Rajya Sabha and ultimately could not be passed. Instead, what the government did, government pronounced an ordinance. So an ordinance was promulgated by the president. But you know, ordinance has a limited shelf life. As soon as the session of Indian Parliament reconvenes, then within 6 weeks of the reassembly of both houses of the Indian Parliament, this ordinance is to be replaced by a law, by a bill. And that's exactly what the government has done. Government has now introduced new triple talaq bill to replace the ordinance that was issued in the month of September this year. But now let's slightly look at the problems with this bill. There are many people who are attacking this bill and saying that this bill is inconsistent. There are inherent contradictions in this bill. Why? Number one, this bill says that if a husband pronounces instant triple talaq on his wife, he will be sentenced to jail. And this jail term would be for 3 years. And this husband has to pay compensation to his wife as well. Critics argue that why are you jailing a husband? Because a matter between husband and wife is at best a civil case. It is not a criminal case. So you cannot jail a husband if he has pronounced instant triple talaq on his wife. Because what is a civil dispute? Civil dispute is a dispute between two individuals. A dispute between you and me is a civil dispute. For example, marriage, divorce, inheritance, so on and so forth. These are civil disputes. So if the dispute between husband and wife is a civil dispute, why are you making it a penal offense? Why are you sentencing an individual for 3 years in jail if it is a civil dispute? Second problem, this bill talks about compensation to the wife. But compensation is normally talked about at the time of divorce. If instant triple talaq does not lead to divorce, that means the marriage is still valid. Why are we talking about compensation? That's another problem with this bill. Third, there are opposition political parties who are saying that how can a husband provide compensation to his wife if this husband is in the jail? That means if the husband is not working, is not earning because he is serving his time in the jail, how can he provide compensation to his wife? On top of that, there is another problem with this bill. This bill also talks about custody of children. But the custody of children is normally talked about at the time of the divorce. When the divorce is formalized, then we talk about who will get the custody of these children, whether husband or the wife. If the marriage is still valid, if the divorce has not taken place because the husband has pronounced instant triple talaq, why are we talking about the custody of children? So there are some inherent flaws in this instant triple talaq bill or Muslim women protection of rights on marriage bill 2018. Let's see what Rajya Sabha has to say on this matter. Then we will have an elaborate discussion on this triple talaq bill. Now let us look at some of the editorials and columns from today's newspaper, beginning with not a decisive factor. You have an option of nota. You're entering into a polling booth, you're pressing the button on an electronic voting machine. You do not want to vote in favor of any candidate that is put out by political parties. You have an option, you can press the nota button. That means none of the above. But let's say, for example, against nota, total number of votes have been polled, let's say 10,000. And highest votes have been polled in favor of nota. Even then, the result will not be invalid. The next candidate, candidate A, if he or she gets 9,999, this candidate A will stand elected from your constituency. That means nota, it has one significance. It tells our political class that your candidates were not acceptable to the people. But since election is a costly affair, if the votes polled in favor of nota are highest, even then the next candidate who got the second highest number of votes will stand elected from your constituency. But we have seen that political parties are blaming now nota for their failures. Because if we look at the vote difference between Congress and the BJP in Madhya Pradesh, for example, the vote difference was 0.1. The vote difference was 0.5 when it comes to Rajasthan. And BJP has cited that since votes were polled in favor of nota, that is why we lost this election. But this article written by Sanjay Kumar, it says that nota is not a decisive factor because increasingly in the recent assembly elections, the votes in favor of nota has seen a decline. There was a decline from 1.9% to 1.4% in Madhya Pradesh, 1.9 to 1.3% in Rajasthan, 3% to 1.9% in Chhattisgarh, 0.6 to 0.4% in Mizoram. It was only in Telangana that there was an increase in the number of votes polled in favor of nota from 0.7 to 1%. That means the data that is now released after the culmination of assembly elections in 5 states, it clearly tells us that nota is not a decisive factor. It is misleading to say that nota determined the assembly election results. That is what you need to understand from this newspaper article. Now let's look at another news. Oxytocin. Oxytocin is a drug, and this drug is primarily used in hospitals for new mothers. In India, after the birth of a child, we have seen that 45,000 women die every year. They give delivery, they give birth to their child, and then they die. And one principal reason for their death is hemorrhage. That means there is excessive bleeding or postpartum bleeding or post-childbirth bleeding. And that is why majority of these 45,000 women, they die. One way in which we can arrest this post-childbirth bleeding is to give this drug called oxytocin. And oxytocin has played a very important role in decreasing the number of post-childbirth deaths in this country. But this oxytocin is also used in cattle, but illegally, because using oxytocin in cattle is prohibited by 1960 law. Prevention of Cruelty Against Animals Law 1960 prohibits using oxytocin on cattle. But why is oxytocin used in cattle? Using oxytocin enables this cattle to produce more milk. But it is cruelty against the cattle. Why? Because when you use oxytocin, the uterus contracts and the cattle is in a lot of pain. That is why this oxytocin cannot be used in the cattle. But there were reports that increasingly cattle have been fed with oxytocin, injected with oxytocin because more and more milk is to be produced. But this milk which is produced, there were reports that this milk is toxic if oxytocin has been used on the cattle. But what the government did, government banned oxytocin. Government banned the retail sale and private manufacture of oxytocin. But now what the Delhi High Court has said, it has restored the retail sale and private manufacture of this life-saving drug called oxytocin. And this editorial primarily talks about that this is the right prescription. But what this editorial highlights is that the government does not think twice before taking a policy decision. If just on the basis of the fact that oxytocin has been found in the cattle and it is injurious to the individuals who drink this milk which is contaminated by oxytocin, you can't simply ban oxytocin, you can regulate its use because this oxytocin has another use. Oxytocin is a very cheap drug. And this very cheap drug has saved the lives of the thousands of the mothers who have delivered their baby. And in absence of oxytocin, they would die. So that is what this issue has been flagged by this editorial. It is time for a post-mortem of how health policy is made in India because that is the only way to safeguard the right to health of Indian citizens. That is what this editorial is all about. Now let's look at another column, making every citizen an auditor. The government or the governments are spending money, let's say for the construction of wells, construction of hospitals, construction of schools. But then what happens? There is an element of corruption involved. Maybe the government withdrew money from Consolidated Fund of India or Consolidated Fund of the state, but ultimately this money was misused. No wells were dug, no hospitals were constructed, no schools were constructed. For that, we need an audit. This audit is primarily done by CAG and other auditing agencies. But a new system emerged in India called social audit. That means audit done by the citizens. And this is considered the best way in which we can have accountability in the system, we can have transparency in the system. Because if the audit is done by those individuals who would use this well, who would use these hospitals, who would use these schools, then it is the best way to ensure that the money is properly spent by the government. In India, for the first time, Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, it mandated social audit, and in fact, Right to Information Act and this social audit has been instrumental in unearthing large number of scams in different parts of this country. But then Comptroller and Auditor General, Rural Development Ministry, various civil society activists, what they did, they made an effort so that this social audit can be extended to other areas as well. And after the sustained effort by the civil society organizations, now what has happened? Social audit units have been established in 26 states in India. Rajasthan, they are yet to establish these social audit units. But this column basically talks about various steps that should be taken to strengthen this social audit units. For example, period 2016 to 2017, 2017 to 2018. 13 social audit units, they registered grievances, they detected irregularities in the implementation of various schemes. And they identified that 281 crore rupees were misspent or misallocated. But then when this report was flagged, highlighted by social audit units, the government had to act on these reports. The government had to ensure that this money is given back to the public. But only 7% of this money was recovered. Only 14% of these grievances that were flagged by these social audit units, they were addressed. And those individuals, those officers who had misappropriated this money, who had misspent this money, disciplinary action was not taken against majority of these public officials. That means in absence of proper implementation of the reports of the social auditing units, we cannot ensure the success of social audit. And that is why there is a need to strengthen these social audits. How can we strengthen these social audits? We should have an independent governing body. which should govern these social audit units. Number one. Number two, we should have more staff and more training should be provided to these staff who are conducting this social audit. On top of that, the reports of the social audit units should be properly implemented. There should be a proper report about how many these recommendations of social audit units have been accepted, have been acted upon by the agencies. And all this information should be in public domain. When all this information is in the public domain, that means social audit units, they will be better in a position to enforce transparency and to fix accountability in the system. And that will be the success of this social audit. And that is the beautiful heading of this column, making every citizen an auditor. And that will enhance the transparency in our funding process. That is what this column is all about. There is another column on the recent climate summit in Poland. For that, please wait a couple of days, then we will have an elaborate discussion on that. Now, let us look at some of the prelims based questions. Number one, the oath of office and secrecy for a minister is contained in which of the following schedule of the Constitution? Third schedule. To the north, Poland is surrounded by Baltic Sea. Let's look at, this is where the Baltic Sea is. Previous year's prelims based question with reference to Indian freedom struggle. Usha Mehta is well known for running the secret Congress radio in the wake of Quit India movement. Now let us look at the mains based question. Comment on the apprehensions surrounding the use of EVMs in Indian elections. Are these apprehensions justified? Now, electronic voting machines have been blamed by all political parties across the board. Electronic voting machines are banned in Germany. Electronic voting machines have never been used in Britain and France. In Netherlands, they spent a lot of money on electronic voting machines, but then they discarded the project. In United States, there are some states which use electronic voting machines, but others do not. So what is so peculiar about Indian electronic voting machine? Are Indian electronic voting machine foolproof, hack-proof? Yes. How? An electronic voting machine in India is like a calculator. Have you ever heard that a calculator has been hacked? Never. A calculator might stop working, but it can never be hacked. To hack something in the technical sense, you need to connect that device to the internet. That's how you can hack that equipment. But an Indian electronic voting machine, it neither has a transmitter nor it has a receiver. In absence of transmitter, in absence of receiver, it cannot be connected to the internet. That means it cannot be remotely operated. That means it cannot be hacked. So why are these political parties blaming electronic voting machines? Because they need a scapegoat. They can't blame their leader. They can't blame their policies. They can't blame their performance in the previous governments. And the only way in which they can save their face is blame on something else. And this time they are blaming electronic voting machines. Previously, BJP used to blame these electronic voting machines. Now the Congress and opposition political parties are blaming these electronic voting machines. But electronic voting machines in India are foolproof, are 100% hack proof. They cannot be hacked. But there is one problem with electronic voting machine, and that problem is lack of transparency. For example, I approach a polling booth, I press the button on electronic voting machine. I don't know whether this vote has been registered in favor of the candidate I wanted to vote or it went to someone else. So there is this lack of transparency. But this lack of transparency can be eradicated by the use of VVPAT. What is VVPAT? Voter Verifiable Paper Audit Trail. What is this VVPAT? It's just like a printer. So we have a calculator type electronic voting machine and we have a printer type VVPAT. So as soon as you press the button on EVM, this EVM will be connected to VVPAT and then a screen will display what is the symbol of the political party you have voted for, what is the name of the candidate that you have voted for, what is the name of the party that you have voted for, and then this slip will be printed, it will be cut and it will drop in the ballot box. But this slip which mentions the details about the candidate you have voted, you will never receive that slip. That slip will go into the ballot box. So that is one way in which we can enhance the transparency in the system. But you need to understand, this VVPAT is an electromechanical device. This VVPAT might malfunction more than electronic voting machine. Because if you have never heard that a calculator has been hacked, you must have heard hundreds of times that a printer has jammed. So this VVPAT, since it is like a printer, it will jam, it can jam, and it has jammed recently in the UP elections of 2017. And there are various other checks on EVMs. There are various codes used on EVMs, and no individual, not even the Election Commission of India, would know where this EVM will go, which polling booth this EVM will go through. That means ultimately there are various checks that are put in place about this electronic voting machine. These EVMs are opened in front of the polling agents of various candidates. These EVMs are stored under the control of Election Commission of India. That means this Indian EVM is safe. This entire apprehension that an electronic voting machine in India can be hacked, these are all lies, should not be believed in. All these apprehensions are unjustified. That is what you will have to defend electronic voting machines in India. That is it from our newspaper analysis. Thank you for being with us. Have a great day.